Tonight, possible names for President-elect Donald Trump's cabinet continue to be revealed. Democrats are looking for new leadership after their devastating general election loss. And now, more than a week after the election, some are still questioning the validity of polling. You're watching Talking Points. Welcome to the November 17th edition of Talking Points. I'm your host, Alex Amico. Before we begin tonight, here are a few stories that you may have missed this week. President Obama called on Donald Trump to stand up to Russia in Berlin on Thursday. He also warned against cyber attacks and the fight against the Islamic State. He was speaking following talks with German Chancellor Angela Merkel. The two stressed the need for cooperation between the two countries. The two also co-wrote a piece voicing their support for the transatlantic trade. Obama hopes to meet with the leaders of Italy, Spain, and France, as well as Theresa May in the coming weeks. An election year surge in anti-Semitism has driven American Jews to gather at a national meeting of the Anti-Defamation League. The League, which is a Jewish civil rights group, managed to gather over 1,000 people to listen to talks on hatred during the presidential campaign. The talks focused on anti-Semitic imagery on social media and the targeting of Jewish journalists. Much of the bias came from the alternative right conservatives. The ADL hopes to raise awareness of the recent surge of anti-Semitism through donations or volunteering. Iraqi forces said that the cloudy skies over Mosul hindered their advances to the northern city. This also obscured visibility, causing the troops to secure areas rather than moving towards the city. Residents of nearby neighborhoods received food packages and aid from special forces. However, Islamic State militants still managed to attack, killing 7 civilians and 2 soldiers. Mosul is the last major area for Iraq militants, and officials are confident of an upcoming military victory. The past 3 days have seen 4 shipwrecks in the Mediterranean Sea. The International Organization for Migration said that over 340 migrants have died or gone missing due to the most recent shipwrecks. The organization also said that the death toll is rising as smugglers force departures despite dangerous conditions. The total casualties for 2016 has increased from about 3,800 to nearly 4,500 in 2016. The number of migrants that arrived in Italy has increased by 13% from last year. The first 100 days. It's a cliche you'll probably get sick of hearing used over and over these next few months. However, there is some significance to it. All the way back in 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt coined the phrase when he was faced with the daunting task of turning America around after the Great Depression. Ever since, the first 100 days of a president's term has been commonly used to measure how effective a president will be. Here to look forward to what we could see from President-elect Donald Trump's first 100 days is Talking Points contributor Paul Dwyer. Paul, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Alex.
So let's start with, obviously there have been a lot of promises made in the campaign from Donald Trump, from health care to immigration to national security to infrastructure. What's the first thing he's going to try to do in his first 100 days?
I think the first main thing is going to be repealing and replacing Obamacare. This is something that all Republicans are behind. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, Speaker Paul Ryan, everyone's getting behind this. A note on this is actually there are 2 provisions in it. He talked about this on 60 Minutes the other night that he wants to keep. That's protecting patients with pre-existing conditions and then also allowing people to keep their children on until they're 26. Those people are saying that this is Trump like going back from completely repealing it, but these in any Republican replacement, these 2 provisions have always stayed. So he's staying true to himself.
Well, maybe one of the biggest keys to his victory was this this law and order campaign. This just idea of bringing law and order back to the country. What could he do on that in the first 100 days?
Back in October, when he gave out his so-called Gettysburg Address type speech, he said on the first day of his presidency, he will go in, cancel every unconstitutional executive order by President Obama. That includes a lot of things. We don't know yet what he's going to consider unconstitutional. He's going to first select a Supreme Court justice. That process will begin. He's going to cancel all funding to sanctuary cities across the nation, something that already has gotten a lot of heat. And sanctuary city mayors have come out in force saying that they will not pay attention. If he cancels that federal funding, then that's going to be a major issue between the federal government
Right.
and the local government as
So
well.
one of the rallying cries, especially toward the end of the campaign, was this idea of drain the swamp of Washington, sort of trying to curtail influence of lobbyists. One of the things was term limits for congressmen and senators. What are the odds of these? Washington's a pretty entrenched place. What are the odds of these actually happening?
You know, a lot of this stuff, it's not very likely. You mentioned term limits. Mitch McConnell did say already that that's not on their agenda. They do not want to go forward with that. So a lot of these proposals, Trump is going to have to get his expectations more, back him up. And I think he's a businessman. You know, he's already softened on some positions. So
He's a negotiator.
yeah,
at
he'll
heart.
make some deals. And but draining the swamp completely, as we've already seen with his transition team, it's not going to be a complete draining the swamp, but we'll see some interesting stuff from him.
All right, we'll see what happens. Paul Dwyer, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Alex.
Coming up after the break, the Trump transition team is working to get prepared prior to Inauguration Day. We'll have the latest. Stay with us.
Every time I hear the alarm bell go off in school, I think it's an air raid.
A lot of houses in our neighborhood have been destroyed.
I like to close my ears and sing songs whenever the bombs come close.
I'm worried our new neighbors won't like us.
But I know it's all gonna be worth it.
I just want my family to be safe.
But these are not my words.
These are not my words.
These are not my words.
Got a quarter?
Donald Trump has had a busy first week as president-elect. Already we've seen a more reserved Trump, one that gets along with President Obama, and has done his best to control his supporters and critics. Over the next few weeks, Trump will finalize his cabinet, which will give people a glimpse of what a Trump presidency will look like. Here to go over the picks and what's to come is Talking Point's political correspondent, Dan Prager. Dan, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start by talking about some of the picks that have already come up, cabinet and administration picks. What do they tell us?
Well, the big pick is Chief of Staff Reince Priebus. It kind of tells us that Trump is going to be a Republican. Reince was the chair of the RNC.
Consummate party man.
Yeah. So it's something that shows that Trump may be less unpredictable than people think. It kind of calms down his critics on the Republican side that say maybe he'll be too unpredictable, maybe he'll be more democratic. The other pick, though, that's big is Steve Bannon, the former CEO of Breitbart. And that shows Trump supporters that he's going to stick with them. He's still the same Donald Trump that ran for office, and he's still the same guy that they fell in love with.
The chief of staff is one of the spots where a president can have a lot more freedom because it's not subject to Senate confirmation. They're hired and fired at the president's pleasure, which is what place where Trump could have picked someone controversial like Bannon. But why is Bannon so controversial? What's the deal surrounding that?
Well, it's Bannon and it's also Breitbart. So first, Bannon has had a couple of troubles with things like racism and anti-Semitism. There was a quote where his ex-wife had to testify in court on a domestic violence charge, and she said that Bannon didn't want his kids going to school with Jews, which is kind of a bit in line.
Worrisome.
It is worrisome.
Yeah.
It's a little in line, though, with what Breitbart has put out. They have a bunch of controversial headlines. I actually have some here. They actually touted the Confederate flag 2 weeks after the Charleston shooting. They asked the question, what would you rather your child have, feminism or cancer?
They also attacked Paul Ryan's kids after he came out against Trump's Muslim ban. They said that their Catholic school screened against Muslims, which we're not even sure if that's true.
They're kind of the face of the alt-right. Not all their news is necessarily true, and they really cater to this alt-right division of the Republican sect that is a bit nationalist, and some of them are a bit racist.
Yeah, well, we'll see what happens with the rest of these cabinet picks. Dan, thank you for joining us. Well, the 2016 presidential election will go down definitely as one of the greatest upsets in political history. Some polls gave Hillary Clinton as high as a 98% chance of winning. Other polls that had her chances of winning in the 60s were even criticized by some as being too cautious. It's been a little over a week now since the Democrats lost. There's been a lot of mourning, reflection, and changes being made within the party. Here to break it all down is Talking Points contributor Galat Malamed. Galat, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start. This is obviously one of the biggest upsets, at least since 1948,
Yes,
with Dewey
definitely.
defeats Truman. How did this happen for the Democrats?
There's really two major things. One thing is that white working class voters, they completely dropped the ball. And they thought they could get it because Obama got this vote 64%. Clinton only got it 45%. You know, she lost Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, all those Rust Belt states that he won. And he basically said in a speech they just didn't campaign hard enough there.
There's a county in Kentucky that's kind of a microcosm of this. It's a white working class county. Literally never voted for a Republican presidential candidate, voted for Bill Clinton by something like 30. They voted for Trump by 50. Elliott County, Kentucky.
Yeah.
And so, you know, after such a bad loss in an election that looks like it was theirs for the taking, there's been some rumbling about changes that need to be made in the party. What have they already done, and what sort of new leadership are they looking to do?
Yeah, well, the biggest thing they've already done, you have Chuck Schumer as the new Senate Minority Leader. And what he's done already is he's added new leadership into the Democratic leadership team. He put in Bernie Sanders on the leadership team, so there you're getting the more liberal, progressive side of the party. But then he also added in Joe Manchin, who's, you know, he's much more moderate. He's from West Virginia, a state that hasn't voted for a Democrat in 20 years. So already uniting both sides of the party. Then, you know, looking forward, Speaker of the House elections, you have Tim Ryan of Ohio. He just announced he's going to run against Nancy Pelosi. And then DNC chairman, that's another big thing. Right now we have, you know, Keith Ellison's looking like the front runner.
And that's really an early coup for the Sanders folks. He was an early
Yeah.
backer of Sanders, but when he announced that he was running, it wasn't only Bernie and Elizabeth Warren coming out for him, but Chuck Schumer and Harry Reid. Yeah.
So he's getting support by both sides. So if he becomes the next chairman, you know, you have strong progressive leadership there who's supported by the Democratic Party as a whole, not just one fraction of it.
So this is a pretty similar position that Republicans were in after 2008. A little less so because Republicans don't have a supermajority in the Senate. But how are the Democrats going to survive these next 2 or 4 years, depending on how the midterms go, with minority in the House, minority in the Senate, not going to control the Supreme Court, not in the White House?
Yeah. Well, the first thing, I think, you know, Chuck Schumer, by adding both Sanders and Manchin into the team, is a good step forward, because if you're a minority, you can't have factions. You need to be working together. And I think we have a clip of it, of what he wants to do going forward with the party.
All right.
We're ready to stand shoulder to shoulder with Republicans,
Oh, God, I hate
working with soon-to-be President Trump on issues where we agree. But we will go toe-to-toe against the president-elect whenever our values or the progress we've made is under assault.
Yeah, so there you have the strategy. Not complete opposition to everything. You want to work together, but you also have to stand your ground. And probably the most important thing for them going forward, too, it might be jumping the gun a little, but you're looking at the 2018 midterm elections already. And they have 10 seats up. Yeah, they have to keep all their seats, especially.
And they've got to defend seats in West Virginia, Indiana, Missouri, North Dakota,
Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, which
it's bad.
Battleground states they lost.
So we very well, depending on how these next 2 years go, we very well could be looking at a Republican supermajority in the Senate coming soon.
Yeah.
Galat, thank you for joining us. Migrants seeking refuge in Australia may now be coming to the United States. The two countries reached a deal Sunday to resettle some of the 1,200 refugees currently being held in offshore facilities to the U.S. Australia's treatment of illegal asylum seekers arriving by boat has been criticized in the past for inhumane conditions at the camps. The deal with the U.S. comes just weeks after the Australian government announced that it's considering permanently banning asylum seekers from ever setting foot on Australian soil. It's the latest addition to the country's already strict immigration policy. With more on the deal and the controversy surrounding Australia's immigration policy is Talking Point's national correspondent, Sarah Nevin.
Nearly 1,200 people are being held in detention camps on the Manus and Nauru Islands in the Pacific, moved there by the Australian government nearly 3 years ago. The majority arrived by boat from all over the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, including Afghanistan, Iran, and Sri Lanka. All are seeking asylum, and around 72% of them are designated refugees. Now, in a one-time deal, those asylum seekers are being offered a permanent home in the United States. The deal comes just weeks after the Australian government announced it's considering amending its immigration law to ban asylum seekers from the country for life. Australia already has a strict policy that restricts people coming by boat from permanently living on mainland Australia. But this change would ban them from visiting the country at all, even if they are married to an Australian citizen or visiting for business obligations. Australia's Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull says the law is essential to the country's border protection and visa policy. It also serves as a reminder to the asylum seekers on Manus and Nauru that they are not welcomed in Australia. Human rights advocates have strongly criticized the treatment of people in the camps, saying they are run more like prisons. The United Nations has investigated allegations of violence, sexual assault, and even self-harm among children, triggered by dire conditions and an uncertainty in their future. In August, Australia said it would close the Manus camp after a court ruled that holding people there was illegal. The United Nations refugee body says the U.S. deal is a step in the right direction. Both Australia and the U.S. have insisted that the deal has nothing to do with the considered ban on asylum seekers. Instead, the U.S. intervened on human rights grounds. Following the announcement of the deal, Secretary of State John Kerry said, "We know that these refugees are of special interest to the United Nations refugee body, and we're very engaged with them on a humanitarian basis there and in other parts of the world." Homeland Security officials are expected to travel to Australia in the coming weeks to start screening refugees. Not all 1,200 will be settled in the U.S. Instead, the deal will prioritize women, children, and families. The deal only applies to people currently being held on the islands. Now, refugees whose applications are rejected by the U.S. are expected to return to their home country, and those who are offered to resettle in the U.S. but reject it will be offered a 20-year visa to Nauru instead. Refugees have already been offered to live in Cambodia, but only a handful, 5 of those people, have accepted that offer. This deal will likely not be carried out before President-elect Donald Trump takes office. Trump has taken anti-immigration stances in the past, so it's unclear if he will fulfill this agreement as president. Back to you, Alex.
Thanks, Sarah. When we come back, Mark Zuckerberg has been under fire recently for the possible role that fake news may have played in the election. We'll take a closer look in just a minute. Don't go anywhere. Well, the prospective polls were dead wrong on election night. Many pollsters were projecting a Clinton blowout, and as the race grew tighter and tighter, the final score echoed a major disruption. Here to tell us more about what happened is Talking Point's political correspondent, Josh Carney. Josh, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Alex.
Okay, so on election night, you and I, we were pretty stunned when we were covering it, and we were reading some of the results. We were seeing Michigan was slipping away from her, Wisconsin was going. How did the polls get it so wrong?
The big disruption that we saw is that polls had a tough time tapping into Middle America and the people who were genuinely struggling that didn't report what they were thinking. Obviously, that's a huge barrier to overcome for pollsters worldwide, but polling in metropolitan areas, in highly populated areas, not in the plains in Middle America, and not in rural areas was the major bane of the polls this cycle. So we can see that throughout, whether it was the Princeton Consortium, whether it was the Cook Political Report, whether it was Larry Sabato, people who are not usually wrong were dead wrong.
This is the biggest polling miss since at least 1948 with the whole Dewey defeats Truman debacle. What's the takeaway for pollsters here? How do they regain public trust after this?
The takeaway for pollsters is they have to find a way to modernize polls. People are not picking up landline telephones anymore, especially those who are younger. And as we can see from polling based in a Washington Post article, that women are actually not picking up these phones in large portions. So you see it having a demographic issue, you see it having a generational issue, and ultimately it's just not the way that people are going to respond in this day and age. So they have to modernize. They also have to adapt, not only in a modernizing format, but also throughout the country. Not every state is the same in terms of the people's responses, in terms of the depth of the political capital.
Okay, so polls need to change. They need to modernize. Short term, long term, what are the specific ways they can do that?
Short term, they have to just be more diligent. They have to be seeking out better turnouts within their polls. They have to be getting larger sample sizes and more diverse sample sizes. In the long term, structurally, polling must shift. It has to be an entire netcast rather than just pockets where people will actually take these calls. And also a long-term objective has to make it easier to respond to these polls, because there is the invisible vote that many people were talking about. And it's not just a buzzword. There were a lot of people who were not projected to vote for Trump who inevitably did.
White women in particular.
White women in particular, and particularly in the suburbs of Philadelphia, where people were polling that they were going to lean heavily towards the Clinton campaign. So you see a huge disruption in counties like that, whether you go to Wisconsin, outside Detroit, even in North Carolina. So there's a major juncture that pollsters face on a national scale.
Well, they've got 4 years to figure it out. We'll see what happens.
For sure.
Josh Carney, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Alex.
In the wake of the election last Tuesday, fake news has been blamed for spreading misinformation on social media that some say influenced the outcome of the election. Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg announced this week that the social media site will be cracking down on fake news in some way. Talking Points contributor Thomas Viola is here to discuss the issue. Tom, thank you for joining us. So I don't think I need to tell you, Facebook this election was awful. It was pretty terrible to have, friends on Facebook sharing completely fake news articles. But did it influence the election? Is there any evidence to suggest that?
No.
Okay.
However, there's also no evidence to suggest that it did not. This is something that's going to take some time. This is going to be a big part of the autopsy of this election, finding out what happened. The evidence that you can see, according to 538 numbers that they released actually just 2 days ago, apparently there was over 8 million shares or any kind of Facebook interaction with the top 20 fake news stories from this election. Comparing that to the top 20 actual news stories from this election, there were only roughly 7 million.
Well, that's no good.
Shares.
That's no good. So they said they're going to try to crack them down in some way. What are some ways Facebook can do that?
Well, the reason that this stuff started popping up in the first place was because Facebook switched from a human curator system for their news to strictly an algorithm. The algorithm doesn't have the ability to tell the difference between a real story from the Denver Post and a false story from the Denver Guardian, a fictional newspaper.
Right. So, so cracking down, obviously the benefit would be less misinformation being spread on Facebook that could shift the person's opinion in an election. What are some drawbacks to cracking down on fake news?
Well, some of the issues that we're seeing is how do you tell exactly what doesn't belong on there? For example, again, going to the Denver Guardian, that is an absolutely falsified news source. However, something like, say, Alex Jones of InfoWars doing a YouTube video in which he alleges that Michelle Obama is a transsexual, while there's absolutely no reasonable proof to back that up, can you really quantify that as 100% false news, as this man's opinion? How do you determine what goes on and what is pulled off? And there is some worry about censorship there.
Right. Alex Jones is certainly a piece of work. Tom Viola, thank you for joining us. On the other side of the break, a breakdown of the latest protests calling for the resignation of the South Korean president. Stay with us.
Every time I hear the alarm bell go off in school, I think it's an air raid.
A lot of houses in our neighborhood have been destroyed.
I like to close my ears and sing songs whenever the bombs come close.
I'm worried our new neighbors won't like us.
But I know it's all gonna be worth it.
I just want my family to be safe.
But these are not my words.
These are not my words.
These are not my words.
Got a quarter?
Welcome back. Corruption charges surrounding the South Korean president have caused thousands to protest and calls for her resignation. Here with the latest is Talking Points international correspondent Elijah Shama.
South Korea saw its largest protest since 1980, with 260,000 people taking to the streets to demand President Park Geun-hye's resignation. The protests come after it was revealed that Park shared classified documents with close friends and spiritual advisor Choi Soon-sil. Choi is accused of using her close ties with the president to raise over $70 million from the country's major conglomerates. Sil's father, Choi Tae-min, is also the founder of the Church of Eternal Life, an obscure Christian sect that's often been described by Korean news as a shamanistic cult. Park faces record low approval ratings, sitting just above 5% approval, with 0% of 20-year-olds supporting her, the lowest of any president in South Korean history. She is a huge figure in the South Korean Saenuri Conservative Party. Park's father, Park Chung-hee, ruled the country for 20 years after gaining independence. Park's family is often viewed as the South Korean equivalent of the Bush political dynasty. She rarely gives interviews, but in the wake of these scandals, she's delivered 2 public apologies from the Blue House. Park faces prosecutors' questionings this week, another first for a South Korean president, though she's being questioned as a witness, not a suspect. Calls for her impeachment remain constant in an attempt to pressure Park to resign, but she has refused. Park still has 16 months left in her presidency's term. If she is impeached or steps down, Park's Saenuri Party could nominate former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon or the runner-up in the 2012 election, Moon Jae-in. One thing is for certain, though, these protests and scandals are unlike anything South Korea has ever seen before.
Thanks, Elijah. 29 years ago today was the conclusion of Senate hearings over the Iran-Contra scandal. The scandal was a sordid period in our country's history involving secretly selling arms to Iran, then funneling the money to Contra rebels in Nicaragua. During the hearings, decorated Marine Colonel Oliver North attracted admiration from many for his testimony, defending his actions in shredding documents related to the activities and insisting he followed orders and saved lives. At the end of the hearings, however, the committee's chairman had his say. Another decorated war veteran, Senator Daniel Inouye. Inouye, the son of Japanese parents from Hawaii, fought in World War II at a time when Americans that looked like him were being put in internment camps. He was part of a unit entirely composed of Japanese-American soldiers that was one of the most decorated in the war. In Italy, he led a platoon against 3 German machine gun nests. Shot in the stomach, he destroyed the first 2 machine gun nests, and as he began to throw a grenade at the third, his right arm was shot nearly off. He pried the live grenade loose, threw it with his left hand, and destroyed the nest. He then charged the remaining Germans, firing his machine gun with one hand until he was shot in the leg and tumbled down a hill. When he regained consciousness, he yelled at his men to get back to their position. At a field hospital, his arm was then amputated without anesthesia. Inouye was given a Distinguished Service Cross for his actions that was later upgraded to the Congressional Medal of Honor by Bill Clinton. On that day in 1987, Inouye took his seat as chair of the committee, his right sleeve hanging empty, his Distinguished Service Cross pin affixed to his lapel. He proceeded to dress down North for his actions in the scandal. He reminded him that the Uniform Code of Military Justice specifically prohibited obeying unlawful orders. He questioned aid to the Contras and the actions of those involved in the scandal, saying, quote, "Should we, in the defense of democracy, adopt and embrace one of the most important tenets of communism and Marxism, the ends justify the means?" Many criticized Inouye for daring to question North's actions. They attacked him in racial terms like they did when he was a young man, calling him a dirty Jap. They said he didn't understand an American hero. They were wrong. Daniel Inouye passed away 4 years ago at the age of 88. He was an American hero in every sense of the word. As a young man in Italy, as a wounded warrior in military hospitals, and as a powerful senator chairing committee, and even as a memory, his legacy of integrity, courage, and patriotism stands tall. That's all the time we have for now. Thank you for tuning in. Make sure to check out our latest blogs and webisodes on CitrusTV.com. We're off next week for Thanksgiving, but tune in when we come back on December 1st. For Talking Points, I'm Alex Amico. Enjoy your break and have a good night, Syracuse.